For a moderator, we decided that probably the best individual to do the job, because he's been associated with him for 6 or 7 years there at Christian Economics, and now has taken over the job as president of that organization in succession to Dr. Kershner. But it's very pleasant to have a real authority on the speaker available to tell you a little bit about him beforehand, and so I'm delighted to present to you Mr. Edward Rowe.
Thank you very much, Colonel Bunker, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, because I do know so much about Dr. Howard E. Kershner, I'm going to make my remarks brief this afternoon, just picking somewhat of the cream of the man's background and contribution. However, I don't want to be cut short, and I was given 10 minutes for this privilege, and I'm going to use every minute of it, and so just relax. Yesterday afternoon, I'm sure that most of you heard Congressman John Schmitz make a very wise statement, and one which we all recognize to be in accordance with reality, when he stated that our best weapon in the struggle for freedom is the truth. Now, there are two concepts of truth abroad in the world, and they have been in the world throughout the history of man. One is the humanistic concept of truth, that truth comes from the rational processes of the human mind, by way of Aristotle, the Renaissance, and the secular philosophers. The other is the Christian concept of truth. That is the idea that truth originates with the God of the universe, the omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, triune God, who is the creator and the sustainer of all things, the one who has revealed himself, who has revealed his mind and will, and has revealed also his heart to man through the written word, the Bible, the Word of God, God's revelation to man, and the living Word, Jesus Christ. Now, the question of the derivation of truth is absolutely crucial, because truth is the foundation of freedom, the basis of freedom. As Jesus said, and it is recorded in John 8:32, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." The freedom movement in America is very fortunate indeed to have as one of its great pioneers, prominent among the original freedom leaders in this country, a man who has been unwavering in his assertion of the divine origin of truth and freedom. For Howard E. Kershner, private ownership of property is a sacred institution because Almighty God established it. Honesty and integrity in business is incumbent upon us, not merely for pragmatic reasons, because it works, but because God has decreed it. The confiscatory, socialistic Keynesian policies implemented by Franklin D. Roosevelt and many of his successors, perpetuated to this day upon the American scene, are perilous, not because they don't work, but basically because they are in violation of what Dr. Kershner chooses to refer to as the moral law of God. Now, some background information about our speaker for this first portion of the afternoon. Howard E. Kershner was born in Kansas, graduated from Friends University, and later studied economics at Harvard. After 24 years of varied business activities, he retired in 1938 to become Executive Vice President of the International Commission for the Relief of Refugee Children in Europe. Later, he organized and was president of the Temporary Council on Food for Europe's Children, and was a member of the Executive Council of Mr. Hoover's Committee on Food for the Small Democracies. He served as a member of the first board of directors of CARE. This is very helpful, by the way, when we get letters from various sources around over the country saying that conservatives do not have any compassion. Conservatives have no heart. Well, as sure as God has a heart, his people have a heart, and I think Dr. Kershner has exemplified this in his own past activities. As vice president of the Save the Children Federation, he set up the post-war program of that organization in Europe. This included help to about 6,000 destroyed schools extending from Finland to Italy and Greece. Howard E. Kershner was one of the organizers of the Christian Freedom Foundation in 1950, and from that time until 1970 served as its president. Since then, he has been elevated to the position of chairman of the board. He founded and still serves as editor-in-chief of the official organ of the Christian Freedom Foundation, and the name of that periodical is Christian Economics. I'm sure many of you read Christian Economics. Dr. Kershner's syndicated column has been published in thousands of daily and weekly newspapers. He has written 7 books. 3 of the most recent are God, Gold, and Government, a classic expression of the philosophy of Christian freedom. Diamonds, Persimmons, and Stars, which is a meditational book with freedom overtones and undertones. And then the latest book, Dividing the Wealth. And this he regards, and many of us as his friends regard, as the crystallization of the wisdom of a lifetime which he has gathered in this freedom movement and through his travels and researches. Dr. Kershner has been decorated with the Order of Leopold by the Belgian government, the French Legion of Honor, the Palme d'Académie by the French government, the Medal of Honor of France, and the Order of Merit of the Union of International Protection of Infants in Geneva, Switzerland. He has been cited 10 times by the Freedoms Foundation at Valley Forge, and one of these citations was the top prize for the entire nation one of these years. He holds an honorary doctorate of humane letters from Washington and Jefferson College, a doctorate in learned letters from Friends University, a Doctor of Literature from Grove City College, Doctor of Humanities from Northwood Institute, and a Doctor of Divinity from George Fox College. Dr. Howard Kershner has carried his investigations into some 70 countries throughout the world. For 30 years, he has crisscrossed the nation as a speaker in churches, colleges, schools, seminaries, clubs, and so forth. He has spoken on over 200 campuses. He's a member of the Society of Friends, and for 5 years was clerk of the New York Yearly Meeting. He has contributed many articles to Quaker journals, and I might say of our Quaker friends, they need Howard Kershner, because he has he has never wavered, even though this is his background and heritage. He has never wavered from upholding the best traditions of biblical faith, Americanism, and freedom, especially when writing for the Quaker periodicals. In 1915, Dr. Kershner married a very great lady, Gertrude Elizabeth Townsend, who is with us in this auditorium, seated back about middle way. If you would wave your hand, Mrs. Kershner, I'm sure the people would like to recognize you. Would you just show us where you are? Right back here. Dr. and Mrs. Kershner are, I think, in close competition with John Schmitz. They have 3 children, 9 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. And last November, Dr. Kershner achieved his 80th birthday. And I would like to say that we appreciated very much the fact that Mr. Robert Welch took time from his busy schedule and crossed the country in order to be present with us on that occasion, as nearly 1,000 people gathered on board the Queen Mary, which has been converted to a banquet facility in part, to honor Dr. Kershner on this occasion. Summarizing then the main contributions of Dr. Kershner: 1, a pioneer in the struggle for freedom in the past 50 years. 2, he has recognized the spiritual and moral basis of freedom and the futility, the futility, I say, of merely rationalistic and humanistic approaches not founded on divine revelation. 3, recognition of the primacy of economics in freedom education. 4, uncompromising insistence that all charity and welfare must arise from private conscience and contribution rather than from raiding the public treasury. 5, unwavering opposition to all socialistic schemes of coercive transfer of wealth because they are in fact systems of legislated theft. 6, recognition of the power of the printed page as an effective medium for influencing the human mind. And I simply call to your attention again that there is a CFF booth, and 3 of the publications which either were founded by Dr. Kershner directly or under his supervision are available: Christian Economics, the youth paper, which is on 150 campuses, bundle distribution, called For Real, and the new magazine, Applied Christianity. 7, exemplification of personal qualities seldom parallel. This, I think, is the prime contribution of Dr. Kershner. He has been a man who has been extremely dedicated to his goal, and that is the goal of freedom and of influencing the minds of Americans and the direction of our society in terms of Christian freedom. And I would like to tell this secret, that ever since the founding of the Christian Freedom Foundation, as a matter of fact, prior to the founding of CFF, Dr. Kershner has given himself long hours, hard work, almost never taking time off for anything without a dime of salary. And I'd like to ask how many of our leaders of freedom can parallel Dr. Kershner in that regard. We don't put the others down, but I do think this is a great record, one that I could not match, and I'm sure most of us could not. Dr. Kershner is a man of stability, resourcefulness, and wisdom. He has numerous talents in many fields, from business and economics and philosophy to music. If you were to visit in his home, he'd probably dig out an old fiddle and play a tune, and then he might get around to the piano. And then he has some kind of a little banjo. I don't know what you call it, maybe a uke or something like that, and he'd get that out and play a tune on it. Then he might do a little singing, and then he finally might get around to the portable Steinway, the mouth organ, and entertain those who are in his home. I close this introduction of this great American with a very brief profile, which I personally drafted on the occasion of his 80th birthday. And it is under the title, My Tribute to Dr. Howard E. Kershner on the occasion of his 80th birthday. What kind of a man is Howard E. Kershner? He's a man who takes life's reverses as they come, with no complaint. But when others are in trouble, or when a nation or a civilization is in trouble, he tackles the abuses which affect his fellow man with rare persistence, wisdom, courage, and enthusiasm. He's the same man in rain or in sunshine, in peace or in battle for the minds of men, in his office or before an audience. His vision takes him beyond the moment and beyond the day to the great trends which threaten to engulf civilizations. He touches the very depth of reality because he knows the truth. He is unshakable because he stands on the solid rock, Jesus Christ. He is forever compassionate because he has seen people suffer and has suffered with them. Howard Kershner is a 5-star general in the most important war of all, the war of ideas. Above all this, he's a cherished personal friend, teacher, and guide along the rocky road of these crisis days. He's a great man of achievement, but most of all, a great man. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm deeply honored to present to you my esteemed boss, teacher, and friend, one of the few living patriarchs of the freedom movement in America, Dr. Howard E. Kershner.
Colonel Bunker, Mrs. McKinney, Mr. Moderator, I am surprised and humbled and somewhat embarrassed by this introduction. I don't think of anything I could say that would be an anticlimax after a build-up like that. And if the second speaker doesn't show up, you see we have plenty of talent right here on the platform, Mr. Rowe. I would like to say that Mrs. Kershner and I are very happy to be among you again. I know of no group of people anywhere in this country so knowledgeable and so patriotic and so numerous as this New England rally. I don't quite know why you call it the New England rally, for I've seen people here from all over the country and abroad. And I hope maybe someday you will call it the National Rally instead of the New England Rally. You are a wonderful group of well-informed people, patriots, all of you. When I was a lad, getting my first job here in Massachusetts, right here in Boston, in fact, in the early years of this century, everybody in this community was Republican. I was up in Vermont not long ago, the stronghold of Republicanism for many centuries, and I heard a good Republican story that I think I'll tell you on the strength of the fact that there just might be a Republican or two left in Massachusetts. A good lady about my age went into the town clerk's office one time in a little village in Vermont, and she said she wanted to change her registration from Republican to Democrat. And the clerk nearly dropped dead. He said, "Why, Mrs. Abernathy, you've been voting straight Republican here for 60 years. What in the world has happened?" Well, she said, "It's like this. I went to see my doctor a few days ago, and he told me I didn't have long to live." "Well, I'm sorry," said the clerk, "but what's that got to do with your registration?" "Well," she said, "if somebody has to go, I'd rather it would be one of them than one of us." I made a mistake not long ago and played Dixie on played Marching Through Georgia on my harmonica down below the Mason-Dixon line, and somebody popped up and said, "Equal time for Dixie," and we had it. So on that principle, I think I better tell you now my favorite Democratic story on the basis of equality. As I said, when I got my first job here in Boston, everybody was Republican, including a young man who finished his theological education and went out to southern Missouri to take his first church. When he got off the train, he found it was a little church way out in the country, 10 miles through deep sand. The day was very hot. He was carrying all of his belongings in a big suitcase and perspiring freely, and the wagon came along. The farmer stopped and invited him to take a ride. And they rode along a little ways. He gratefully accepted, of course, and the farmer said, "Young man, what's your politics?" Without thinking, he said, "I'm a Republican." The farmer stopped his wagon and he says, "Get out, I wouldn't take you another 100 yards. So he climbed down. He was walking along through the deep sand, perspiring freely. Another wagon came along. The farmer invited him to ride. He accepted gratefully. In a little while, that farmer said, "Young man, what's your politics?" Now, this man had had a good education. He could think logically. And he said, "This time I'm a Democrat." "Well, you are," said the farmer. "We're very happy to welcome you into our community. We hope you'll feel at home and be welcome." In a little while they came to a watermelon patch. The farmer stopped his team and he said, "I'd like you to help me gather some of these watermelons. I want to take a few of them home." The young minister said, "Are they your watermelons?" "No," said the farmer, "they're not my watermelons, but I'm going to take a few home anyway." "Well," said the young minister, "you surely wouldn't expect me to steal watermelons, would you?" "No," said the farmer, "I wouldn't expect you to do anything, but the sand is deep and it's a long ways to where you're going and it's pretty hot and there won't be any more wagons along." With that, the farmer went over to the watermelon patch. The young man sat there thinking pretty seriously for a while, and directly he climbed down out of the wagon and went over, and as he was crawling through the fence, he lifted his eyes toward heaven and he said, "Oh Lord, can you forgive me? Here I've been a Democrat only 10 minutes and I'm already a thief." I want to talk to you a little bit today about some thieves who are stealing not only our watermelons but our dollars. When I came to Boston here for my first job way back in the early years of this century, you could buy a newspaper for 1 cent. Any paper in America at that time for 1 cent. Now most of them are 15 cents. At that time I could buy a good meal down here on Bromfield Street for 10 cents, all the beef, potatoes, and vegetables, and 2 slices of bread and butter that I could eat. You couldn't buy it today for less than $1.50. At that time, the postage for a letter was 2 cents. It went up to 3 cents, to 4 cents, to 5 cents, to 6 cents, to 8 cents. And each jump came after a shorter interval of time and was bigger than the previous ones. The subway fare at that time was 5 cents. It went to 10 cents, to 15 cents, to 20 cents, and then it jumped to 30 cents and to 35 cents. This is in New York. I don't know what it is in Boston today. It's probably that much or more, and this is not the end. The cost of education in our country has quadrupled in the last 12 years. And I don't know anybody anywhere that would stand up and say it's even as good as it was 12 years ago. And yet the cost of it has quadrupled. When I was a younger young man, the salary of a congressman was $3,000 a year. And we sent to Washington people who had done something in a trade or profession so that they could spend the rest of their active years at small salary and were willing to serve in Washington for the honor and prestige involved in representing the people in Congress or in the Senate or any other high office in Washington. So they served for $3,000 out of a motive of patriotism. Today we pay our congressmen 14 times that much, or $42,000, and who would say that our congressmen today are any better than they were back there in those $3,000 days? As late as World War II, it cost $30,000 to maintain a senator or a congressman in Washington. That is, in addition to his salary, for his office, his staff, and all the perquisites, it cost $30,000 as recently as World War II. We have multiplied that by 20, and it now costs $600,000 to maintain a senator or a congressman in Washington. How many of you think your senator or congressman is worth that much? Well, we've got a few like Mr. Schmidt, who spoke to us yesterday, and Mr. Ashbrook, and a few others who are worth it. But mostly, I think we would agree they're not worth 20 times what they were just 30 years ago, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Nixon accepted a 100% increase in his salary. When he did that, he boxed himself in so that he could not say anything to labor leaders when they demand 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 40, 50% increase. If he did, they would say to him, "You so-and-so, you take 100%. What have you got against our 20%, 25%, 30%? I wrote him at that time and I said, "Mr. President, the only way you can get out of this jam is to get on television, tell the country you made a mistake, you're going to roll it back to where it was, and call upon labor in this country to stabilize wages and stop this inflationary spiral. But if you will do that, the country will receive it gratefully and you'll have some influence. Failing to do it, this is going to get worse and worse." I received a letter from a third secretary stating that my interesting suggestion would be given careful consideration. And that's as far as it has gone, ladies and gentlemen, as you well know. So somebody continues to steal our watermelons, don't they? Now what are we going to do about it? We're attempting to stabilize prices and wages. Ladies and gentlemen, I say to you on the authority of having seen this tried in country after country around the world that it will not work. An attempt to stabilize prices and wages by government decree always results in two things: scarcity and black marketing. You tell the farmers they have to raise produce and bring it to cities and sell it for less than it costs them to produce, and they won't do it. They'll raise what they need for themselves and their families and what they can black market, and for the rest, you people in the cities will go hungry. That's the history of these attempts to control the economy by government decree. It's not going to work, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I can give you some idea of how and why the process by which our watermelons are being stolen by giving you the figures on the deficits for the recent administrations, beginning with Mr. Truman. In 8 years, Mr. Truman ran up a deficit, a combined deficit for the 8 years of $1,600,000,000. Well, that looks awfully small today. I think any one of us would welcome something of that sort if we could trade it for what we have. But that alarmed the country in that day, and we said, oh no, that won't do. We've got to elect a man who'll practice economy and balance the budget, and Mr. Eisenhower promised to do it, and we elected him. But Mr. Eisenhower, in 8 years, ran the deficit up 10 times larger than Mr. Truman, a combined deficit of $15.7 billion in his 8 years. And the country was alarmed, and we said that can't go on. So we decided to change parties, and we put in Mr. Kennedy, and in 3 years, Mr. Kennedy exceeded the Eisenhower deficit of 8 years. The Kennedy deficit for 3 years was $17.6 billion. And then we were alarmed again, and we tried another man from Texas, thinking that the South believed in economy and frugality. And in 5 years and a half, Mr. Johnson more than doubled the Kennedy deficit and ran it up to $36.1 billion. These 4 presidents in the space of 24 and a half years ran a combined deficit of $71.6 billion, something unheard of. So we said, now we'll have to try a good, honest, frugal Quaker this time and elect Mr. Nixon. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we hadn't seen anything up to that point. Although he came in on a promise to balance the budget every year, to stop the erosion of the dollar, to practice frugality and get spending down, taxes down, that's the platform on which he came in. He has, as you know, done exactly the opposite. And if the rest of this year, the 4th year of his administration, comes out in accordance with the estimates, Mr. Nixon will have increased the deficit more than $100 billion, or more in 4 years, a third more in 4 years than 4 previous presidents did in 24 and a half years. That shows you, ladies and gentlemen, how inflation progresses as it proceeds, how the rise grows faster and faster and faster. That should tell you, projecting the future a few years, what's going to happen to the rest of our watermelons. They'll be stripped from our field. Why don't we learn not to do this? We've tried 3 Democratic administrations, 2 Republican administrations. The same thing keeps happening. It reminds me of a husband and wife who were discussing the arrival of their second child, and a little boy, the first child, who sat there listening to them, And when the husband said, "I think we'll have to move into larger quarters," the little fellow piped up and he says, "It won't do any good. He'd follow us." So it appears that whatever we do, this increase in the deficit's going to follow us from year to year. We've got to find a better solution than merely changing from one party and one candidate to another. By the end of the Nixon administration, the public debt in this country will be approaching $500 billion. It was $367 billion when he took over. The estimate is for $490 billion at the end of his first term. Now, if we give him a second term, nobody would hazard a guess what it's going to be by that time. I'll leave that to you. And I wonder sometimes if we aren't about as confused in our handling of public affairs as a policeman I used to know up in Montreal, Canada. One of the professors had gone across the street in midwinter to consult a colleague. This was at McGill University. And after he finished his business with his colleague, this professor of biology noted that his colleague's goldfish were not healthy, and he said, "If you let me take these goldfish home with me, I'll put them in the right solution and they'll soon be healthy and well again." So his colleague agreed, and he gathered up the goldfish out of the bowl and wrapped them up in his handkerchief, put it in his pocket, and started running across the street in the deep snow in dead of winter, and he hadn't neither hat nor coat because he was just coming over for a short errand, and he slipped in the snow, and to catch himself in the fall, he pulled his hand out of his pocket and sprayed the goldfish throughout the snowdrift. And knowing how important they were to his colleague, he immediately got down on all fours and started scratching around in this snow to see if he couldn't find the goldfish. And a policeman, turning the corner on his beat, looked down the street here and saw this bare-headed, coatless man in midwinter on his all fours scratching around in the snow. So he went down there and he said, "Brother, what are you doing?" And the man said, "I'm hunting for goldfish." And the policeman said, "Well, now, my friend, if you'll tell me where you live, I'll take you home." And the fellow was still scratching around in the snow, and just at that moment he found one, and he held it up to the policeman, and he said, see, I found one." And the policeman's jaw dropped, and his eyes took on that stare of one who is suddenly and greatly frightened. And he said to the man down here in the snow, he said, "Brother, will you take me home?" If whoever belongs to that light there is not going to use it, I wish he'd turn it out. I like to see you people when I'm... There, that's better. Now, if you want to use that light, you can turn it on, but until you get ready to use it, please allow me to see these good, lovely people here that I'm talking to. Through the 60s, we've increased our deficit at the rate of about $10 billion a year. Through the 70s, it appears that we're going to increase it at the rate of about $40 billion a year. Now, what's going to happen to us if we keep on doing that? That's what we're interested in. I remember, ladies and gentlemen, when a Congress of the United States over a 2-year period spent $1 billion, and it shocked the nation. There was much talk about the $1 billion Congress. Not many of you remember that, but it happened back in the late 90s. $1 billion Congress, one Congress in 2 years' time spent $1 billion, and now in 2 years' time we're spending $500 billion, ladies and gentlemen. And we're not raising it, of course, in taxes, we're just diluting the money that's already here by issuing new money, and that's what keeps running up the deficit all the time. I was asked the other day why babies cry. Well, if you were wet and cold and hungry and knew that your share of the national debt while you were still in your cradle was $2,200, you'd cry too, wouldn't you? Reminds me of the bishop who'd finished his speaking tour and returned to Boston here. This is about 25, 30 years ago, before planes had taken over. And he gave his last dollar to the Pullman porter. And he started out through the station, and a bum stopped him and asked him for something to eat for breakfast. And the bishop said, well, now, I'm going to eat here in the lunchroom in the station, and you come right along with me, and we'll go over and have a good breakfast. And he put his arm around the shoulder of the bum, and they marched off to breakfast. They had a good breakfast and enjoyed it. And when the waitress brought the check, the bishop remembered that he didn't have a cent, and he was very embarrassed. And the bum saw the point and pulled out a roll of bills and paid the check. And then the bishop said, well, now, my good man, I'm ashamed of myself, and I don't want you to do this. And I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll get in a taxi and go out to my house, and I have money there, and I'll pay the taxi bill and give you enough to get back downtown and repay you for this breakfast. Oh, no, you won't, said the bum. You took me once, but never again. Ladies and gentlemen, how many times are we going to be taken by people who promise to balance the budget and practice economy and then do exactly the opposite? How long can we be fooled that way? How long will we take it? Let us see what it is that's robbing us of the value of our dollars. This, of course, is inflation. What is inflation? Inflation is properly defined as an increase in the quantity of money, period. That's all there is to inflation, an increase in the quantity of money. Now, that isn't all that needs to be said about inflation, but that's a proper definition of inflation. That is what it is. And let us show you how this has come about. In 1939, the quantity of money in this country, that is, the money on deposit in the banks, the money in the tills in our stores and places of business, and the money in our pockets, was $35 billion. Today, it's $236 billion, 6.5 times greater than it was as recently as 1939. And while this curve showing the increase in the quantity of money has gone up about like that, there are some other curves. Prices have gone up almost in proportion. Wages have gone up almost in proportion. The increase in the national debt has gone up almost in proportion, all originating from the increase in the quantity of money. Some way we've got to stop increasing the quantity of money, or else we're going to inflate clear out through the roof and finish the destruction of the dollar, as has happened in country after country around the world throughout history, ladies and gentlemen. What makes us think we're going to be smarter or abler than anybody else and be able to avoid this fate? And you march right down the road of inflation, and I've followed it in many, many countries, for I've carried my investigation into some 60 countries throughout the world. And I can see all the earmarks, all the blazed trees, all the footprints, everything that accompanies complete 100% inflation taking place in our country, ladies and gentlemen. It is happening here. It will continue to happen unless we get at the root cause and stop it. Now, there's no use to say that we can control prices unless we also control wages. For 90% of the cost of goods and services is payroll. Whenever you go to buy anything, remember, at least 90% of that on the average is a wage cost. And there's no such thing as thinking that prices will ever come down unless wages also are stabilized and we begin to figure our remuneration in terms of man-hour output, rather than arbitrarily fixed wage scales regardless of what production is. The only fair way to fix a wage scale is the free market, in which every worker is paid for his services what the people who buy those services are willing to pay and what they think is fair. For after all, the consumer is the one who decides whether goods are going to be bought or pile up in the marketplace. And under a free market economy, which is what we believe in, the price that the remuneration that every one of us is paid is in terms of the estimate of our fellows who size up and fix the wage that they think we're entitled to on the basis of the demand for the service that they render. Now, when you have a wage that is fixed by that method, you will find it closely geared to production and output. And that type of economy can go on and prosper and reach higher and higher ground, but you cannot do it when you have wages fixed by pressure groups. Labor unions who are so strong they can almost write their own ticket. Now, I don't want to blame them so severely, because government increases the quantity of money. That is inflation. That sends prices up itself, and then the unions, in an effort to keep up with the process, keep jacking up their wages higher and higher and higher, and trying to get a little surplus, you see, to get ahead of the trend a little bit before it catches up with them. And so we have this continually rising scale of wages under pressure of people who have special privilege granted to them by government. The only reason unions can do that is because of the special privilege that government has granted them. For instance, local police will rarely enforce the laws against assault and battery. A manufacturer has no chance of winning a strike because the police will not stop the goons in the various squads that keep anyone from coming in to take the jobs that have been deserted, that people no longer want. You could hire new men to take those jobs and break the spiral of wages, but local police will rarely enforce the laws against assault and battery, so people are afraid to take those jobs. You get up before the Labor Relations Board, not once in 50 will you get a fair decision, because it's the politically wise thing to do, you see, to please the masses. And they are calling the turn nowadays, and we've got to find some way to deal with that if we ever succeed in righting our situation. Now, politicians face a very sharp dilemma. They know that if they do not increase the quantity of money, that people cannot buy the goods that are being offered at ever higher and higher prices. They won't have money enough to buy those goods, so they know there's going to be unsold goods and unemployment unless they increase the quantity of money. And no politician can face depression and unemployment and be reelected. As Al Smith said so aptly in 1928, nobody shoots Santa Claus. And if two candidates are here and one of them offers you more than the other one, who's going to be elected? Now, these men in Washington are smart men, and they know that. And they know they'll not be reelected if there is unemployment and depression, so they increase the quantity of money to put more money in the pockets of the people in order that they can buy the higher priced goods. You see what a dilemma that is? And it's easy for a congressman and a senator to say, well, if I don't do this and get reelected, somebody else is going to promise even more and he'll get elected, and it's better for me to stay in than it is for him to get in, you see, because that would be even worse than it is for me to have this job. Now, how are we going to break that cycle? That is our problem. This leads me to tell you of an economic principle which I think I was the first to discover, and the only one that keeps talking about it all the time, and I call it Kershner's Law, and I hope it will become known as that someday. And it reads like this: when a self-governing people empower their government to take money from some and give it to others, the process will not stop until the last bone of the last taxpayer is picked bare. Now think it over, ladies and gentlemen. Here's a group of people over here that have more than the rest of us. We're down on this level, and here's some up here that have more. The politicians have learned that if they go up here and dispossess these people of something and distribute it down here on the lower level, that they can get votes. Maybe they dispossess one and distribute it to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 down here, and that means they lose 1 vote and get 5 or 6 more votes, you see. That's the way this operates, and so they keep on doing it. And that's not going to stop as long as our government has the power to do it, until the last bone of the last taxpayer is picked bare. And there seems to be no indication that we're stopping it at all. Even this week, ladies and gentlemen, Congress whooped through a 20% increase in Social Security. Now that's going to cost us something like $7 or $8 billion a year, on top of the cost of already 20 or 25 billion, I forget exactly what it is. Now, will they stop there? Will the guaranteed family income stop at where they first started? That's going to cost us about $20 billion. Where are any of these programs going to stop as long as Congress has the power to create more money? And what they're doing, you know, is not to appropriate money, they're increasing debt. And the new money that is issued is only worth its proportion of the money that's already here. We have, say, a certain quantity of money. If we double that quantity of money, then the money is only worth half as much as it was before, because there's twice as much money. And Congress is simply diluting our money when they incur these deficits and run up these big spending programs, diluting our money and robbing more and more the people who have money in the savings banks and who have it in the form of life insurance and mortgages and government bonds and all forms of fixed wealth. It is being progressively destroyed by the issuing of more money. Now that leads me to the second principle, which I hope will someday become known as Kershner's second law, and it says that periods of sound money throughout history have been periods of moral advance and progress, and periods of unsound money throughout history have been periods of moral decay and decline. Now, do you see that happening in our country today? Crime, promiscuity, drugs, liquor, divorce, all sorts of degenerative things happening to us. One of the main reasons, and I'm not talking about the moral reasons, that's something else. I would like to have a lecture on that someday, but I'm talking about the economic reasons now, and that's something quite apart. One of the reasons is the fact that people have lost confidence in the monetary unit. They have begun to think that they cannot win by the old-fashioned methods of hard work and thrift and industry, and they're trying the shortcuts. I heard a fellow say the other day who'd robbed a bank. He said, well, all I did was to try to help my government in the process of distributing the wealth. Why should you put me in jail for that? For that's what the government's doing. You ought to put them all in jail if that's the thing, you see. Well, when there's no hope, if we only could have justice in our land, that's exactly what we do with these people who are running us into inflation and destroying our dollar. Periods of sound money are periods of moral advance and progress, periods of unsound money of decline and decay. Let me give you a very personal illustration. When that lovely lady and I back there, who was introduced to you a while ago, were married 57 years ago, a dollar was a dollar, and nobody ever thought of such a thing as it not being a dollar. And we looked around and we said, now if we're honest and work hard and save our money and live very carefully, we can accumulate something for the future, we can educate our children, we can do something for the church, and we can retire by and by and have a happy old age. And we set to work doing that. And all the other kids getting married did that too. And when everybody has that idea, you see the savings flow out into assembly lines, into factories, into schools and colleges and churches and railroads and steamships and hospitals and all the things that make up a civilization. These things come from saving. People save when they have hope in the future. Destroy that hope in the future, and you stop the process of capital accumulation. And then your country starts its period of decline, ladies and gentlemen. You have to have incentive, reason why people will save. That means you have to have honest money that will not lose its purchasing power. The kids getting married today look around and they say, well, what will the dollar be worth 5 or 10 years from now? A dime, a nickel, a penny, maybe nothing. I hear them say there's no percentage in saving that kind of money. We better blow it in while we can still have a good time with it. It'll buy something today and we can have a good time. In the future, we don't know. You see how people lose their long pull integrity and trade it for the shortcut stimulation, and they resort to not only crime but to speculation and to crafty schemes of all kinds to get money out of people by hook or crook because they haven't any confidence in the old-fashioned method. And that's why I have formulated this principle, which history bears out, ladies and gentlemen, that periods of sound money are periods of moral advance and progress, and periods of unsound money are periods of decline and decay. Think that over, ladies and gentlemen. There's a lot of truth in that principle. And here I ought to stop and say that we've got to have economic education in this country before we ever solve this problem. We've heard a lot about patriotism here. We've heard a lot about anti-communism, and it's all been fine and good, and I endorse it 100%. But we'll never make much progress along those lines until people know why these rosy schemes will not work. Socialism looks wonderful on paper. If you don't know why it won't work, you're apt to be deceived by it, as many good people are in this country. But if you know your sound economics, you'll know that minimum wages destroy jobs. You'll know that profit is a good thing and not a bad thing. You will learn that the more millionaires there are in a country, the higher the standard of living in that country. And you can almost gauge the standard of living in any country by the number of millionaires in that country. Now, you don't know these things unless you've had pretty sound economic education. And you're likely to fall for Marxism unless you know why these rosy schemes are not going to work out and are not going to pay off. So my plea is for more sound education in economics, so we'll know the whys and the wherefores. I had an argument one time with a leader in the government of Czechoslovakia in Prague. And he said, I don't like capitalism because it puts too much money into the hands of a few people. And I said, you've got it all wrong, sir. It doesn't put money into the hands of those people. They earn that money by doing something productive that the people want to have done. They create the wealth which makes them wealthy and makes everybody else better off than they were before. And he laughed at me. And I said, I will give you an illustration. You used to have a man named Bata here in Prague who became a multimillionaire manufacturing shoes. But during Bata's regime, you had better shoes and more shoes and cheaper shoes than you ever had before or since Bata. Now, how did he hurt anybody? True, he became a multimillionaire. But everybody that wore shoes got cheaper and better shoes than they did before or since. But you didn't like him. You drove him and all the men like him out of this country, and they're over in our country now, Bata is and others, adding to the wealth of our country. And you're a poor, run-down at the heel country, and we are still a rich country. I don't know how long we're going to be that way if we keep following Marxist philosophy, but we were at the time I said this to him, which was 5 or 6 years ago. We're a rich country because of these extraordinary men that you didn't want, that you drove out. And then I pulled a cheap pen out of my pocket, and I held it up before him, and I said, I paid $1 for this pen. If you could find a way to make it for 90 cents and sell it for 90 cents, you would become a rich man, and you wouldn't hurt anybody because everybody that wanted to use a pen would get a cheaper pen than they're getting now. That would make you a millionaire by benefiting everybody else. I said, you don't understand what profit is. You think profit is something gouged out of the consumer or something held back from the workers. You're not paying them enough, or you're charging the consumer too much. I said, profit isn't that at all. Profit is something taken out of costs. You learn how to make something cheaper or better than anybody else is making, you will make a profit, and that's the only way you can make a profit. Aside from a few crooks and swindlers, of course, we always have them, and we'll have them in any system. But they are the exception and not the rule. But how many people know the essential nature of the profit system? How many know that of every dollar industry earns in this country, after all other expenses are paid, and what is left is divisible between owners on the one hand and workers on the other, how many know that the worker gets 93.7 cents out of that dollar, and the owner gets 6.7 cents out of that dollar? The owners get 90, the workers, let me state it correctly now, the workers, out of every dollar that's available for distribution between owners and workers, the workers get 93.7 cents. The owners, that is the stockholders or the proprietors, get 6.3%, or 15 times as much goes to labor as goes to owners. 15 times as much. And yet we hear people grouching in this country and saying that the corporations are getting it all, that the workers aren't getting any. Well, they're getting 15 times as much as the owners, and out of that 6.7% going to owners, half of it is kept in reserve to make the jobs of the workers more secure than they otherwise be for improvement of the plant and so on. You can't ever accomplish much by reducing profits in this country, for they're only 1/15 of the amount that goes to labor. And if you had a heavy truck that was stuck on a hill and your cargo was an elephant and a dog, and you decided to unload the dog, it wouldn't help you much in getting the truck up the hill, would it? Well, you can confiscate all you want to of profits, and you'll stop business in the process, but you won't reduce the cost of living appreciably, because the wages there is 15 times greater than the profits. Now, how many people know that? If they did know it, they wouldn't be Marxists, ladies and gentlemen. But they have fallen a victim to the propaganda that says the corporations are getting the big end of what they make and labor's getting the small end, and they think that's wrong, and it would be wrong, and they don't know it isn't true, so they turn to Marxism as some way of correcting that error. If we could correct it by sufficient economic education so they would know the facts, we would destroy Marxism, ladies and gentlemen. What we need is a vast amount of economic education. We need to know, for instance, that the only way to curb inflation is to return to the gold standard. I've had people tell me, well, you can't return to the gold standard. That would cause inflation or deflation or disorganization of some kind in the economic world, and it wouldn't be at all safe or proper to do it. I don't think it would, ladies and gentlemen. If we went about it the right way, we could return to the gold standard without fear of either inflation or deflation. Now, the way to do it, in my opinion, is to repeal all the laws that prohibit us from buying and selling gold. Right now, if it were not against the law, I'd go and buy some gold. Probably you would too. But I can't do it. It's against the law. Now, if we would repeal those laws and let anybody buy and sell gold anywhere, at any time, at any price, we'd soon know what gold was worth. In fact, that's the only way we know what anything is worth. The only way we know what any commodity or service is worth is what it will bring in the open free market. And I defy you to tell by any other method what anything is worth. All right, we don't know what gold is worth because there's no free market in it. All right, let's repeal the laws against buying and selling gold and let everybody buy it and sell it. The price would go up, I don't know how much. Maybe it would be $100 an ounce. Or maybe it would be double what it is now. Certainly it would be much higher than it is now. But when we found out what it was worth in the open market, then we could return to the gold standard on that basis without fear of either inflation or deflation. In my youth, we could take our paper to the bank and get gold for it. No questions asked, no time, no blanks to fill out, just shove in your paper and take out the gold. And nobody did it because the gold wouldn't buy any more than the paper. And nobody would do it today if we returned to the gold standard. We wouldn't have a run on the banks to take out the gold because we have established the value of that gold in terms of our present paper currency, and nobody would go and change his currency, which is easy to carry around, for a lot of heavy gold, which isn't easy to carry around, and we'd be back on the gold standard. And some people say there isn't enough gold. I say to you, if gold were selling in the open market at the free market price of it, the price that would be established if we allowed people to buy and sell it, that we would have more gold rolling out of the hills of California than is rolling out of South Africa today. Those mines are closed because the price is fixed below the cost of mining the gold. But if the gold went up to the price of what it's actually worth, then those mines would all come back into operation and we'd soon have plenty of gold. Now, the reason why I think this is so important is it's the only way to stop this inflationary cycle. No congressman or senator is strong enough to stop increasing the quantity of money when he knows it will result in unsold goods and unemployment. That is, in other words, depression. But if we had a gold standard so that the government had to redeem its currency in gold, it would dare not issue more than it could redeem in gold. You see, that stops the increase in the quantity of money. And it's the only way that has ever been found in economic history of the world to stop politicians from spending more and more and more money that they haven't got, and running up debt and finally destroying the monetary unit through inflation. The gold standard is the only thing that has ever been devised that will stop that, ladies and gentlemen. And I say to you, if we don't return to the gold standard, then we're going to inflate out through the roof and ruin the dollar just like it's been ruined in many, many other countries. I remember the days when women went to the factory gates in Germany and drew their husbands' pay twice a day in order to rush away and spend it while it still had a little purchasing power. Twice a day. They couldn't even wait another hour, or it would lose a lot of its value at that moment. I remember in Athens one day I turned in $30 worth of traveler's checks and got 1,000,000 drachmas. And I saw them stacking this money up here on the table like cordwood. And I said to myself, well, I never thought I'd make it, but here I am, a millionaire at last. And I looked at this money, and it had the right color, beautifully printed. It had some wonderful figures on it. Here was a 50,000 drachma note, staring me right in the face, and other big denominations. And I gathered that all together in a great big suitcase and started off down in the street feeling very, very rich. And I felt that way until I had to pay 70,000 drachmas for our evening meal. And I found that all I had was a great big uncomfortable heavy load to carry around with me. Now that's going to happen to us, ladies and gentlemen. What makes us think it isn't going to happen to us? It's happened everywhere else. We're doing all the things that bring it on. Deficit spending going up all the time, each administration exceeding the record of the last one. We've gone from Democrat to Republican and back again, and still it goes on year after year, increasing all the time. Nothing will stop it, ladies and gentlemen, unless we return to the gold standard. It's that, or else we're going to inflate out and ruin the dollar, as has happened in country after country throughout the world. And unless we learn our lesson, ladies and gentlemen, that is the punishment that's going to be meted out to us. Now we hear people say, oh, you can't do that. That would bring on a depression. We don't dare do it. Well, that's what General Lucius Clay and the other advisors from the American government told the German government after World War II. And Mr. Ludwig Erhard said that he wasn't going to do it. He said we're going to have a sound mark and we're going to have no debt at all. And we're going back to the gold standard, and we're going to sell all the government-owned businesses back to private individuals, and we're going to balance the budget every year. And General Clay said, well, my advisors tell me that that isn't the way to go about it, that you can't do it that way. And Ludwig Erhard said, my advisors tell me the same thing, but we're going to do it anyway, and they did. And Germany, which was the most nearly destroyed of any country in Europe, looted of all of its movable wealth, both the east and the west zone, occupied by 4 hostile powers, flooded with 12 million refugees from the part of Poland and East Germany that were annexed and taken away from Germany, partly by Russia and partly by Poland, and with most of her houses and industry destroyed, Germany in that low condition did this thing, balanced the budget, returned to sound convertible currency, and achieved the greatest prosperity in the world in a matter of 3 or 4 years, ladies and gentlemen. And we could do it in our country if we were a mind to do it. We'd be willing to go back to the gold standard and send to Washington men and women who would do it, who would put country first instead of the hope of being reelected, who would be willing to sacrifice their own political career if necessary for the salvation of their country. When Napoleon came to power in France after the days of the Commune, which was communism, of course, in that country, everything was at a very low ebb in France at that time, just about the lowest we can imagine. And Napoleon's advisors said to him, now you'll have to issue currency without gold cover. In other words, you'll have to resort to deficit spending. And Napoleon refused to do it. He said, what we cannot pay for in sound money, we will do without. And he did. And when he was finally defeated at Waterloo, prosperity in France was restored in a matter of few years because the currency had not been debauched and ruined, ladies and gentlemen. This is all false propaganda that they're feeding us, that the only way to preserve prosperity in our country is to continue this deficit spending. That's the way not to do it, ladies and gentlemen. That's the way to bring revolution on us. And when we get to this catastrophe, then they'll say, well, the only answer is Marxism. And that's the thing they've been aiming at all the while. And they've corrupted the money and resorted to this deficit spending merely as a means of taking over their country and making a tyranny out of it instead of a self-governing people, ladies and gentlemen. We just might as well face up the facts and see how it's being done. I was in Russia not long ago discussing problems with one of the leaders of the government there, and this man presided over a whole room of an enormous big building, and they had 300 research people there studying every book and every paper and every important pamphlet and document issued anywhere in the world, and drawing up reports on all of this literature and sending it up to their chiefs, who used it as a means of evaluating trends throughout the world and formulating the Politburo policy with reference to how Russia was to go on with the conquest of the world. And they know more about us than we know about ourselves. There's nothing that I know of comparable in this country to what's going on over there. The hard, systematic study of trends of thought and action in every country. And this man said to me, he said, you know, Dr. Kershner, that a mixed economy cannot endure, that either it will go all socialist or it will swing back to freedom. And he said, you have already mixed so much socialism into your economy that you can't take it back, and you're going to walk into our camp. We don't have to fight you. We don't have to urge you. We'll just sit here and wait until you walk into our camp and are converted to Marxism. And then he leaned back in his chair and laughed uproariously. And I said, no, sir, you're going to be surprised. We're waking up in our country, and we're not going to do that. Oh, yes, you are, he said. And he reached around and took some books from a shelf back of his desk. He opened them up to various places and read me passages justifying Marxism. And I said, oh, yes, I can name the professors that wrote those passages. He looked a little surprised at that. But he said, you see, we already have your leaders on our side. He said, the professors in your colleges are on our side. And we'll be over to finish the takeover of America sooner than you think. That was an exact quotation, ladies and gentlemen. That's what they believe. They believe they've got us already in the bag. And they do, if we don't wake up pretty soon and get on with this process of economic education. Have I got 5 or 6 minutes more? Yes. You remember there was a Reese investigation in Congress some time ago? And one of my friends was counsel for that committee. And his job was to interview the presidents of the leading foundations, and he told me what they said. And one of them, who was at the head of the Ford Foundation at that time, he said, we who run the big foundations formerly worked for the State Department or for the United Nations Rehabilitation Organization or for some of the big relief organizations. And we were working at that time on instructions from the White House to bring about such sociological and political changes as would make union with Russia easy and comfortable for the American people. This was the head of the Ford Foundation, and I've given you his exact words. And I've published them throughout America and said it on the platform 1,000 times. Nobody ever questions it. On instructions from the White House, working to bring about such sociological and political changes as would make union with Russia easy and comfortable for the American people, ladies and gentlemen. That's the kind of government we have. We better do something about it pretty quick, or that's what they're going to do. Now, with this very charming lady sitting beside me here holding a stopwatch on me, I think that's as good a place to stop as any. I'm sorry that I can't go on till 5 o'clock. I had high hopes when I understood that my distinguished colleague was not going to be here. I thought maybe I might have till 5 o'clock. But thank you so much for listening to me.